Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The morning air was crisp, the scent of pine and dew weaving through the elven forest. Raina, a young elven warrior with long silver hair, moved quietly through the woods. Her sharp green eyes scanned the trees, the familiar terrain comforting her. For years, she had patrolled this section of the forest, ensuring that the peace of her homeland remained undisturbed. It was a simple life, and one she cherished. She didn't need politics or the complications of the outside world. All that mattered was the safety of her people and the serenity of the woods. Yet even in this timeless place, change had arrived. The announcement had come months ago, a first in Elven history. The council had declared a presidential election, something unheard of among the elves. For millennia, the Elder Council had ruled in harmony with nature, guiding the people with wisdom and patience. But now, two factions had risen from the depths of their society, pulling the elves into a divide. On one side were the conservatives, a group who held fast to tradition, believing that the ancient ways of harmony with nature were the only path forward. Their leader, Elder Myron, was a respected figure, known for his fierce devotion to preserving the old ways. On the other side were the reformists, led by Ilara, a young and brilliant mind who believed that progress, particularly through technology, could bring a new age of prosperity to the elves. Her ideas were radical, and many feared they would lead to the destruction of the very forests they swore to protect. Raina had heard all of this in passing, but she didn't care. The forest was her home, and her sword was her voice. Politics had never interested her. She left that to those who thrived on debate and rhetoric. As she moved through the dense underbrush, her thoughts were interrupted by a strange noise up ahead, a low murmur, followed by the sound of footsteps. She stilled, hand instinctively going to the hilt of her sword. There weren't supposed to be any travelers here, not in this part of the forest. Raina moved silently toward the sound, her elven grace allowing her to slip through the trees like a shadow. As she neared the source of the noise, she saw them. A group of elves stood in a small clearing, gathered around a campfire. There were 4 of them, 2 from each faction, their faces lit by the flickering flames. They spoke in low voices, but even from her distance, Raina could hear the tension in their tone. "Are you sure this will work?" one of them asked, a tall elf dressed in the deep green robes of the conservatives. "If this gets out, the council will have our heads." "It has to," replied another, a shorter figure in sleek grey armor at the uniform of the reformists. "We've come too far to back down now. The future of the elves depends on it." Raina crouched low, her ears twitching at the words. She edged closer, her curiosity piqued. What could these 2 factions possibly be discussing out here in the middle of nowhere? "I don't like this," the conservative elf said again, shaking his head. Elder Myron didn't approve this meeting. "He doesn't need to know," the reformist replied coldly. "If you want your precious forest to survive, you'll do as we agreed." "The reformists have made their decision. You either help us, or we find another way." Raina's stomach twisted at the words. There was something dangerous here, something more than just political rivalry. As she listened, her mind raced. If the conservatives and reformists were plotting something together, it could mean disaster for the forest. But before she could gather more information, a twig snapped beneath her boot. The sound was small, but enough to alert the group. The elves in the clearing turned in unison, their eyes locking onto Raina's form in the shadows. "Who's there?" one of them shouted, drawing a weapon. "Show yourself." Raina's heart pounded, but her training kicked in. She straightened, stepping out of the trees with her hand still resting on the hilt of her sword. "I don't want trouble," she said calmly, keeping her voice steady. "I was patrolling and overheard your conversation." The group exchanged glances, clearly uneasy. The conservative elf stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "What did you hear, warrior?" "Enough to know you're up to something," Raina replied coolly. "Whatever you're planning, it doesn't sound like it's in the best interest of the forest." The tension in the air thickened. Raina could see the reformist reaching for a small device on his belt, something that looked like a communication tool, but before he could use it, she drew her sword in a flash, the blade gleaming in the firelight. "I wouldn't do that," she warned, her voice low. "I'm not looking for a fight, but I will defend myself if I have to." The reformist hesitated, his hand hovering over the device. The other elves seemed unsure of how to proceed, their eyes darting between Raina and each other. "Listen," Raina continued, keeping her sword steady. "I'm not interested in your politics, but whatever this is, it's bigger than an election, isn't it?" The conservative sighed heavily, lowering his gaze. "You're right. This is about more than just a vote. There are forces at play here that you wouldn't understand." Raina frowned, her grip tightening on the sword hilt. "Try me." Before anyone could respond, a sudden rustling in the trees behind them made everyone freeze. Out of the shadows stepped a figure, cloaked in black, with eyes glowing a faint blue. The air around them seemed to hum with a strange energy, and Raina felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "What is this?" she whispered, taking a step back. She had never seen magic like this before. The cloaked figure chuckled, a low, eerie sound. "You should not have interfered, warrior." In a flash, the figure raised a hand, and a pulse of dark energy shot through the air, aimed directly at Raina. She barely had time to react, raising her sword just in time to deflect the blow. The force of it sent her stumbling back, but she managed to stay on her feet, her heart racing. The other elves scattered, clearly not wanting to be involved in whatever dark magic this was. Raina found herself alone, facing this new, unknown threat. She gritted her teeth, raising her sword in a defensive stance. "I don't know who you are," she growled, "but you're making a mistake." The figure smiled beneath the hood, their glowing eyes narrowing. "No, warrior, it is you who have made the mistake. You should have stayed out of this." With that, the figure unleashed another wave of dark energy, more powerful than the last. This time, Raina barely managed to dodge it, the blast scorching the ground where she had stood moments before. She needed to end this quickly. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, her sword slicing through the air. But before her blade could make contact, the figure vanished in a swirl of shadow, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Raina stood there, breathing heavily, her sword still raised. Whoever that figure was, they were dangerous and they were involved in something much bigger than an election. Her thoughts raced as she sheathed her sword and turned back toward the clearing. The other elves had fled, leaving only the remnants of their campfire behind. Raina stared at the dying flames, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and concern. She had never cared about politics, but now, it seemed she had no choice. Whatever was happening in the forest, it was more than just a power struggle between factions. Something darker was stirring, and Raina knew she couldn't turn her back on it. With a heavy sigh, she turned and began the long walk back to her village. Whether she liked it or not, she was now a part of the fight. Raina returned to her village as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the towering trees. Her mind raced, replaying the encounter with the mysterious figure in the faction meeting. She had hoped to keep her distance from the political tension that had gripped the Elven society, but now she was entangled in it. The memory of that dark magic still clung to her, a reminder that something much bigger and more dangerous was unfolding. She reached her home, a modest wooden structure nestled at the edge of the village. Inside, the familiar scent of herbs and wood smoke greeted her, but tonight, there was no comfort in it. She moved mechanically, setting aside her sword and slipping out of her armor, her muscles aching from the day's events. Normally, she would take comfort in the routine, but tonight, her thoughts were scattered. The figures she had overheard in the woods, their conversation had hinted at something more, something deeper than just an election. She could still hear the echo of that cold voice. "There are forces at play here that you wouldn't understand." It was clear now that this election wasn't just about choosing a leader. Both the conservatives and the reformists were hiding something dangerous. And then there was that cloaked figure, wielding a magic Raina had never encountered before. Dark magic wasn't supposed to exist in their world, Not anymore. The ancient texts spoke of it as a forbidden force, eradicated centuries ago. Yet, here it was, alive and well. Raina sank into a chair by the fire, her thoughts spiraling. She had never wanted to be involved in the political realm, but with what she had witnessed, there was no going back. Someone had to know about this, someone she could trust. But who? Her instincts told her that going to the council would be a mistake. Yet they were too embroiled in the conflict between the factions to be impartial. Elder Myron? No. He was too deeply aligned with the conservatives. And Alara? As much as Raina respected her vision for progress, she couldn't ignore the fact that the reformists had their own hidden agendas. For the first time in her life, Raina felt truly uncertain. She had always relied on her instincts in battle, but this was different. This was a fight in the shadows, where trust was a rare commodity. The crackling of the fire snapped her out of her thoughts. She couldn't sit here all night, mulling over possibilities. She needed answers. Tomorrow, she would seek out someone she knew she could rely on. Not an old friend, Karen, who had left the village years ago to live as a hermit deep in the forest. He had always had a talent for seeing through the surface of things, and maybe, just maybe, he could help her make sense of this tangled web. The night passed restlessly, and as dawn broke over the treetops, Raina was already on her way. The path to Karen's home was long and winding, but Raina knew it well. She had visited him often in her youth, back when life was simpler, and the world seemed far less complicated. Karen had always been different. He never cared for village life, preferring the solitude of the forest and the company of the creatures that lived there. It was nearly midday when she reached the small clearing where Karen's home stood. The cabin was humble, overgrown with vines and moss, as if it had grown out of the forest itself. She knocked on the wooden door, the sound echoing in the quiet. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Kieran's familiar face. His once stark hair was now streaked with gray, and his sharp eyes, though older, still held the same spark of intelligence. "Raina," he said with a slight smile, his voice deep and gravelly from years of isolation. "I wasn't expecting visitors today." "I wish this were a casual visit," she replied, stepping inside, "but I've found myself in the middle of something. Something dangerous." Karen motioned for her to sit by the hearth as he poured them both a cup of tea. "Tell me," he said simply. Raina recounted everything at the secret meeting in the forest, the dark magic, and the figure who had attacked her. Karen listened quietly, his expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long time, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Finally, he spoke. "What you've described. It's troubling, to say the least. Dark magic hasn't been seen in our world for centuries. The fact that it's reappeared now, during the election, can't be a coincidence." "Do you think it's connected to the factions?" Raina asked. Karen nodded slowly. "It has to be. The timing is too perfect. But what concerns me more is the figure you encountered. If they're using dark magic, it means there are forces at work here that go far beyond political rivalry. This could be a threat to the entire forest." Raina's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing Kieran confirm it made the danger feel even more real. "What do we do?" she asked. Kieran leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought. "We need more information. Whoever that figure was, they're part of something bigger. You need to get closer to both factions, find out what they're really after." Raina grimaced. The last thing she wanted was to involve herself further in the election, but Kieran was right. If dark magic was involved, it was no longer just about politics. The fate of the Elven world was at stake. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "But I don't know who to trust." Kieran smiled faintly. "Trust your instincts, Raina. They've never failed you before. And remember, not everyone is as they seem. The conservatives and the reformists both have their secrets. You'll need to tread carefully." With that, Raina left Kieran's cabin, her mind set on her next course of action. She would have to return to the village, to the heart of the political conflict she had once sworn to avoid. But now, with dark forces at play, there was no other choice. As she made her way back through the forest, she thought about the two leaders at the center of the election, Elder Myron and Alara. Both had their strengths, and both had their flaws. Myron was a staunch traditionalist, fiercely protective of the forest, but his unwillingness to adapt to the changing world could be dangerous. Alara, on the other hand, was a visionary, but her eagerness for progress could lead to reckless decisions. Raina sighed. She would have to speak with both of them, try to understand their true motives. It was the only way to unravel the mystery of the dark magic and the forces manipulating the election. When she reached the village, she went straight to Elder Myron's home. His dwelling was grand compared to the others, a testament to his status as one of the oldest and most respected members of the council. She knocked on the door, and a moment later, the elder himself appeared. "Raina," Myron said with a slight bow, "I've been hearing whispers that you've become involved in the election." "I'm surprised. I never took you for someone interested in politics." "I'm not," Raina replied bluntly. "But I've discovered something that concerns me, something that goes beyond the election itself." Myron raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I need to speak with you about the Conservatives' plans. I overheard a meeting in the forest, and what I heard, well, it's troubling." Myron's expression darkened, and he stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. Inside, the home was filled with the rich scent of herbs and the flicker of candlelight. Raina took a seat, watching the elder carefully as he sat across from her. "Tell me everything," he said. Raina recounted the events once more, leaving nothing out. Myron listened intently, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in thought. "This is unfortunate," he said slowly, "but not entirely unexpected. There are those within the conservative faction who have grown desperate. They believe that in order to win, we must resort to unconventional methods." "Dark magic?" Raina pressed, her voice sharp. Myron's gaze flickered. "I do not condone such things. But there are those who believe the ends justify the means." Raina's jaw tightened. "And you? Do you believe that?" Myron sighed. "I believe that the forest must be protected, no matter the cost." Raina stood, her hands balled into fists. "There's always a cost, Myron. Dark magic doesn't just destroy your enemies, it destroys everything." Myron didn't respond, his expression unreadable. Raina turned and left without another word, her mind swirling with anger and frustration. If the Conservatives were willing to use dark magic, then they were no better than the reformists. Both sides were blinded by their ambitions. As she left Myron's home, she knew her next step would be to confront Alara. But first, she needed to clear her head. The forest called to her, its familiar serenity offering a brief respite from the chaos of the village. But as she stepped into the trees, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She froze, her hand instinctively going to her sword.